The Soul's Meal. This is a true story, one of the most haunting cases I've ever witnessed as a child in Mexico City. A story I've kept buried for 20 years, afraid that speaking it aloud might somehow resurrect the horror that unfolded in that decaying apartment building on the outskirts of the city. Only as an adult did I come to understand that the real demon wasn't the dead, but the wounded soul seeking vengeance. I was 13 when it began. The summer air hung thick and oppressive over our neighborhood, the kind of heat that makes concrete sweat and metal railings burn to the touch. Our apartment building stood like a weathered sentinel, 4 stories of crumbling concrete, peeling paint, and rusted pipes that groaned and rattled in the night like restless spirits. The elevator had stopped working long before I was born, leaving only concrete stairs worn smooth by decades of footsteps. My mother, Elena, raised me alone in apartment 7 on the 2nd floor. She cleaned office buildings by day and sometimes took in mending work at night, her fingers always moving, always working, even when exhaustion lined her face. My father had disappeared when I was too young to remember him, leaving behind only a faded photograph and a silence that my mother never filled with explanation. "Diego," my mother would say, "we may not have much, but we have each other, and that makes us richer than many." I believed her then. Now I wonder if either of us would have found comfort in those words had we known what waited across the hallway in apartment 8. Don Guillermo had lived there for decades. Once, according to neighborhood legend, he had been a hero, saving the building owner Don Torres from the great flood of '85. Now he was just an old man, withered and bent, pickled by years of alcohol and grief. His son Carlos had died in a car accident years before, leaving behind a young boy, Miguel, whom Don Guillermo had raised until the boy fled to America at 15. I remembered Don Guillermo from before, when he would sometimes pat my head as he passed in the hallway or slip me a candy from his pocket with a conspirator's wink. But after Miguel left, something in him changed. The alcohol consumed him. Through our thin walls, I would hear him shouting at ghosts, bottles breaking against walls, and sometimes in the quietest hours of the night, muffled sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest. "It's not our business, Diego," my mother would say when I asked why we didn't help him. "Sometimes pain makes people do things they wouldn't otherwise do." I didn't understand then how prophetic those words would prove to be. The first strange thing I noticed was on June 21st, the summer solstice, though I didn't know the significance of that date then. I was returning from playing soccer with friends as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement of our street. As I climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, I felt an unnatural chill emanate from the hallway despite the day's lingering heat. When I reached our floor, I saw Don Guillermo's door was ajar, unusual for the old man who had grown increasingly paranoid. From within came a strange, sweet smell, cloying and somehow wrong, like fruit on the edge of rotting. As I passed his door, the single bulb lighting our hallway flickered violently, plunging the corridor into momentary darkness. In that split second of blackness, I swear I saw something move inside Don Guillermo's apartment, a shadow that seemed too tall, too fluid to be the old man. When the light sputtered back to life, there was nothing there but the partially open door and that sickly sweet smell. Just a power surge, I told myself, hurrying to our apartment, and probably just his cooking. That night I awoke to whispers. Not the indistinct murmurs of neighbors through thin walls, but clear, rhythmic whispers in a language I didn't recognize. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling my small bedroom with their insistent cadence. I pulled the sheet over my head, a child's instinctual protection against the unknown, and eventually fell back into a troubled sleep filled with dreams of shadowed figures watching me from corners. The next morning I convinced myself it had been a dream, nothing more. But as I left for school, I noticed something new in our hallway, a single black feather lying directly outside Don Guillermo's door. I stared at it, feeling an inexplicable dread creep up my spine. As if sensing my gaze, it shifted slightly, though there was no breeze in the stagnant hallway air. "Don't touch things on the ground, Diego," my mother scolded when she saw me staring. "You don't know where they've been." If only we had known. It was a week later when she first appeared. I was doing homework at our small kitchen table when I heard unfamiliar footsteps in the hallway, lighter than Don Guillermo's shuffling gait, more purposeful than the hesitant steps of the other elderly residents. My curiosity drew me to our door's peephole. A woman stood at Don Guillermo's door, her back to me. She wore a simple black dress that hung loosely on her thin frame, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp angles of her profile. She carried a blue plastic container, the kind used for leftovers, and knocked with 3 precise taps. When Don Guillermo opened the door, I caught a glimpse of his face, gaunt and yellowed, but with a spark of recognition that quickly turned to something else. Fear, shame, I couldn't be sure. "Lucia," he said, the name barely audible through the door. "It's been many years." The woman Lucia tilted her head slightly. "Too many, Don Guillermo." "May I come in? I've brought you something special." Her voice was melodic, almost hypnotic, with a quality that made my skin prickle. Don Guillermo hesitated, then stepped aside, allowing her to enter. Just before the door closed behind them, Lucia turned slightly, and I caught a glimpse of her eyes, dark and gleaming with an emotion I couldn't name, but which made me instinctively retreat from the peephole. That night the whispers returned louder and more insistent, and for the first time I heard Don Guillermo scream, not in anger, as he had during his drunken rages, but in pure primal terror. "Mama," I whispered, shaking her awake. "Something's wrong with Don Guillermo." My mother listened to the now silent hallway, then sighed. "He's probably drunk again, Diego. Go back to sleep." "But the woman—" "What woman?" My mother looked fully awake now. I told her about Lucia, about the blue container, about Don Guillermo's scream. "It was probably just a relative visiting," my mother reasoned. "And you know how he gets when he drinks. Your imagination is running wild, mi hijo." But I could see a shadow of doubt in her eyes, a hesitation that betrayed her own unease. She had heard something in that scream too. The next day I saw Doña Ramirez, the self-appointed gossip of our building, cornering my mother in the stairwell. "Have you seen her?" she whispered excitedly. "The woman visiting old Guillermo?" "I haven't," my mother replied cautiously. "Who is she?" "Her name is Lucia Vega, daughter of Don Ernesto, who used to live in the neighborhood. Remember him? He and Guillermo were drinking buddies years ago." "What happened to Don Ernesto?" my mother asked. Doña Ramirez shrugged. "Disappeared about 9 years ago. Some say he went back to his village, others say—" She lowered her voice further, though I could still hear from where I pretended not to listen. "Others say he owed money to dangerous people." "You know how it is." I saw my mother cross herself reflexively. "And the daughter, why is she visiting Guillermo now?" "Who knows? Maybe she's just being kind to an old man. Her father and Guillermo were close. I hear she brings him food almost every day now." Later, when I asked my mother about their conversation, she brushed it off. "People love to gossip, Diego. It's none of our business." But over the next few weeks, it became increasingly difficult to mind our own business. Lucia's visits grew more frequent, first weekly, then every few days, until she was coming daily, always with the same blue container. And with each visit, Don Guillermo seemed to deteriorate further. I would see him occasionally in the hallway, each time thinner than the last. His clothes hung from his frame like they belonged to someone twice his size. His skin took on a grayish tint that no amount of sunlight seemed to improve. And his eyes, once bright despite his alcoholism, became dull and unfocused, as if he was looking at something beyond the physical world. Most disturbing were the changes to his apartment. A smell began to emanate from under his door, not just the expected odors of an elderly bachelor's home, but something deeper and more unsettling. something that reminded me of the time a rat had died in the walls of our building, that sweet, putrid smell of decay that seems to cling to the back of your throat. "It's probably just old food," my mother said when I mentioned it. "You know he doesn't clean much." But the smell grew worse day by day until residents on the first floor began to complain that it was seeping through the vents into their apartments. Don Torres came to inspect, knocking repeatedly on Don Guillermo's door without answer. "He must be out," he concluded, though we all knew Don Guillermo rarely left his apartment anymore. That night I had the first of what would become recurring nightmares. I dreamed I was trapped in a freezer, my breath fogging in front of me, my limbs growing numb with cold. In the dream I wasn't alone. An old man I didn't recognize was there, his body partially dismembered, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended death. He was trying to speak to me, his blue lips forming words I couldn't understand. And standing over him was a shadow woman shaped, but somehow wrong, elongated and fluid with eyes that burned like embers in the freezing darkness. I woke gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat despite the cool night air flowing through our open window. And in that moment between sleep and full wakefulness, I swear I heard a voice whisper directly in my ear, "He's eating his sins, little one, bite by bite." The next day I couldn't shake the nightmare's chill from my bones, even in the summer heat. As I passed Don Guillermo's door on my way to school, I noticed something that made me stop cold, a small streak of what looked like dried blood on the floor just outside his apartment. Before I could examine it closer, Don Guillermo's door opened. I froze, expecting to see the old man, but instead Lucia emerged. She looked different in daylight, older somehow, with deep lines around her mouth and eyes that hadn't been visible in the dim hallway lighting. She carried an empty blue container and a small garbage bag that seemed unusually heavy for its size. She saw me staring and smiled, a tight, calculating expression that never reached her eyes. "Good morning, young man," she said, her voice as melodic as I remembered. "You must be Diego." A chill ran through me at the realization that she knew my name. "How do you—" "Don Guillermo has mentioned you," she said, though I doubted the old man had spoken to her about me. "He says you're a kind boy. That's rare these days." She stepped closer, and I caught a scent clinging to her, not the decay emanating from the apartment, but something older, earthier, like grave soil after rain. "Don Guillermo isn't feeling well," she continued, "but my special recipe is helping him process things. Things that have been weighing on him for a very long time." She reached out as if to touch my face, and I instinctively backed away. Something flashed in her eyes, amusement perhaps, or satisfaction at my fear. "Smart boy," she murmured. "Caution serves the living well." With that cryptic statement, she walked past me toward the stairs, the garbage bag swinging gently at her side. Just before she descended, she paused and looked back. "Tell your mother, Elena, I look forward to meeting her. We have mutual acquaintances." The way she said my mother's name sent another wave of dread through me. How did she know who my mother was? What did she mean by mutual acquaintances? As soon as she disappeared down the stairs, I hurried to Don Guillermo's door and knocked, worry for the old man, temporarily overcoming my fear. There was no answer, but I noticed the door wasn't fully closed. Gathering my courage, I pushed it open slightly. "Don Guillermo," I called into the darkened apartment. "Are you okay?" The smell that hit me was overwhelming, that same sweet putrid decay, but now mixed with something chemical and sharp that burned my nostrils. I couldn't see much through the narrow opening, just a sliver of the living room where shapes were barely discernible in the gloom. But something caught my eye. A strange symbol drawn on the floor in what looked like red paint or something else. It resembled a star inside a circle with unfamiliar markings around the edges that seemed to writhe and shift as I stared at them. From deeper in the apartment came a sound, a wet gurgling noise followed by what might have been words, though in no language I recognized. And then, silhouetted against the dim light from a back room, I saw a figure that couldn't possibly be Don Guillermo. Too tall, too thin, moving with a jerking gait like a marionette with tangled strings. I slammed the door shut and ran to our apartment, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. My mother had already left for work, so there was no one to tell about what I'd seen, no one to convince me I was just letting my imagination run wild. That day at school, I couldn't focus. Images from Don Guillermo's apartment kept intruding on my thoughts, the symbol on the floor, the shadowy figure, Lucia's knowing smile. During lunch, I felt so nauseated I couldn't eat the cafeteria food, reminding me too much of that sweet, rotting smell. My friend Marcos noticed my distraction. "What's wrong with you today?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost told him everything then about Lucia, about Don Guillermo's deterioration, about the nightmare and the whispers. But something stopped me, some instinctive fear that speaking these things aloud would somehow make them more real, more dangerous. "Just didn't sleep well," I mumbled instead. When I returned home that afternoon, something had changed in our building. The other residents were gathered in the lobby, speaking in hushed, anxious tones. I spotted my mother among them and pushed through the crowd to reach her. "Mama, what's happening?" She pulled me close, her expression grave. "The water, Diego. Something's wrong with the water in the building." Doña Martinez from the first floor was describing the problem, her voice shrill with disgust. "It came out of the tap brown, and the smell like something dead. My husband thinks an animal must have fallen into the water tank on the roof." Don Torres assured everyone he would have someone check the tanks immediately, but the unease in the lobby was palpable. As we climbed the stairs back to our apartment, I noticed the hallway on the second floor seemed darker than usual. The single bulb dimmer, as if something was slowly draining its energy. "Mama," I said as we reached our door, "I need to tell you something about Don Guillermo and that woman, Lucia." My mother's face changed, a shadow crossing her features. "What about them?" I told her everything, the visits, the blue container, Don Guillermo's deterioration, what I'd glimpsed inside his apartment that morning, and Lucia's strange comment about looking forward to meeting her. As I spoke, my mother's face grew paler. When I mentioned the mutual acquaintances, she sat down heavily at our kitchen table. "Mama, do you know her?" "No," she said quickly, too quickly. "I've never met her." But there was something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Fear, yes, but also recognition, and perhaps guilt. "I don't want you going near that woman, Diego," she said firmly. "And stay away from Don Guillermo's apartment. Promise me." "But what if he needs help? He looks so sick." "Promise me." The intensity of her demand startled me. My mother rarely raised her voice. "I promise," I said, though even as the words left my mouth I felt a strange certainty that it was a promise I wouldn't be able to keep. That night as we ate dinner in uneasy silence, a piercing scream tore through the building, not from Don Guillermo's apartment but from the floor below. We rushed to our door and heard commotion in the stairwell. My mother motioned for me to stay behind as she stepped into the hallway, but I followed anyway. Doña Martinez was on the stairs, her nightgown soaked with water, her face a mask of horror. "Blood!" she was screaming. "There's blood in the water!" The residents crowded around her as she described turning on her shower only to have dark red liquid pour from the shower head, filling her bathroom with its metallic stench. As the commotion continued, I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the feeling of being watched. Slowly, I turned toward Don Guillermo's door and froze. It was open just a crack, and in that narrow space I could see an eye, dark, unblinking, and unmistakably not Don Guillermo's. It was watching the chaos with what I could only describe as satisfaction. As if sensing my gaze, the eye shifted to meet mine, and in that moment I heard a voice in my head, clear as if someone had whispered directly into my ear. "Every meal has its price, little one, even a soul's meal." The door closed silently, leaving me standing there shivering despite the summer heat, as the first true understanding of the horror unfolding in our building began to take root in my mind. Something unnatural was happening in apartment 8, and somehow I knew my mother and I were about to be drawn into its hungry darkness. The Soul's Meal, Part 2. The next morning our building buzzed with anxious conversation. Don Torres had called a plumber to inspect the water tanks on the roof, but by noon they'd found nothing. No dead animals, no obvious contamination that could explain the discolored water in Doña Martinez's apartment. The plumber suggested it might have been rust from old pipes, but no one seemed convinced. I overheard him telling Don Torres in the stairwell that in 20 years of plumbing, he'd never seen water turn that particular shade of crimson. Perhaps it was just the lighting, the plumber suggested half-heartedly. Sometimes copper pipes can make water look reddish. But Doña Martinez was adamant. It was blood, she insisted. I know what blood smells like. By afternoon, the water ran clear again, and most residents tried to forget the incident. Another quirk of living in an aging building with failing infrastructure. But I couldn't shake the connection between the water, the increasing stench from Don Guillermo's apartment, and Lucia's ominous visits. That night my mother worked late cleaning offices, leaving me alone in our apartment. I sat at the kitchen table trying to focus on homework, but found myself straining to hear any sounds from across the hall. For hours there was nothing, not even Don Guillermo's usual shuffling or coughing. Then, just past midnight, I heard the distinct sound of 3 precise knocks on Don Guillermo's door. Curiosity overwhelmed caution. I crept to our door and peered through the peephole. Lucia stood in the hallway, wearing the same black dress, but now with a red shawl draped over her shoulders. She carried her signature blue container in one hand and what looked like a small cloth bag in the other. As she waited, she began to hum a low, melodic tune that seemed to make the air in our apartment vibrate with each note. The door to apartment 8 opened, but I couldn't see who answered it. Lucia's voice, though soft, carried clearly through our thin walls. "It's time for your special meal, Don Guillermo. I prepared it with extra care tonight." I heard a weak response, Don Guillermo's voice, but so diminished I barely recognized it. "Please, no more, I can't." "But you must," Lucia replied, her tone suddenly hard as stone. "Every bite brings your salvation closer. Every morsel is one step toward atonement." She stepped inside and the door closed behind her. For several minutes there was silence, and I began to think I should return to my homework. Then came a crash from inside Don Guillermo's apartment, like furniture being overturned, followed by his voice suddenly stronger, crying out, "No, get away from me! I see him now standing behind you, Dios mío! What have you done to him?" Lucia's response was too quiet to hear, but Don Guillermo's agonized wail penetrated every wall. "I didn't know, I swear I didn't know what he was doing to you." Another crash, then silence. I stood frozen at our door, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain it could be heard throughout the building. Should I call someone? The police? But what would I tell them? That an old man was arguing with his visitor, that I'd been eavesdropping before I could decide. The hallway light flickered violently, then went out completely. In the sudden darkness I heard Don Guillermo's door open. Through the peephole I could see nothing but blackness, yet I sensed movement in the hallway. Something gliding past our door, something that displaced the air with an unnatural chill. Then came a whisper so close it seemed to originate from inside our apartment. "Little watcher, always watching. Will you still watch when your eyes understand what they see?" The hallway light sputtered back to life, revealing Lucia standing directly in front of our door, staring at the peephole as if she could see me through it. Behind her, something moved, a shadow that didn't match her silhouette, tall and distorted, seeming to hover just above her shoulders. For a split second the shadow took form, the vague outline of a man's upper body contorted in a position no living person could maintain. I stumbled backward, a scream caught in my throat. By the time I gathered my courage to look again, the hallway was empty. Sleep evaded me that night. I sat on my bed with all the lights on, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. When my mother finally returned home around 3 a.m., I was still awake, though I pretended to be asleep when she checked on me. I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I'd seen. The memory of that shadow figure made my tongue feel leaden, as if speaking of it might somehow summon it. The nightmares began in earnest that night, vivid, terrifying dreams that felt more like visitations than products of my own mind. In these dreams, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. At its center stood an old freezer, the kind with a heavy lid that opens from the top. From inside came a rhythmic thumping like someone weakly beating against the metal walls. A voice, Don Ernesto's, though I somehow knew this despite never having heard it in life, called out from inside, "She's feeding him my flesh, she's feeding him my soul." In the dream, I approached the freezer, my hands reaching for the lid, though every instinct screamed for me to run. Just as my fingers touched the icy metal, I would wake drenched in sweat, the taste of copper filling my mouth. The next morning, I noticed dark circles under my mother's eyes that matched my own. She moved around our small kitchen, mechanically preparing breakfast without her usual humming or chatter. When she thought I wasn't looking, I caught her staring at Don Guillermo's door with an expression I'd never seen before. A mixture of dread and recognition, as if confronting an old fear she'd thought long buried. "Mama," I finally ventured, "do you know something about Lucia, about what she's doing to Don Guillermo?" My mother's hands stilled over the stove. For a long moment she said nothing, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight I didn't understand then. "There are things in this world, Diego, that we're not meant to interfere with. Ancient things." "Cycles of debt and payment? What kind of debt?" I pressed. She turned to me, her eyes suddenly fierce. "The kind that must be paid. Now finish your breakfast. You'll be late for school." She didn't speak another word about it, but that afternoon I noticed her placing small pouches of herbs above our doorway, and windows, sage, rosemary, and other plants I didn't recognize, bound with red string. Protection was all she said when she caught me watching. The deterioration of our building accelerated over the following days. The water problem spread to other apartments. Sometimes it ran rusty brown. Other times it carried that sickly sweet smell that now permanently emanated from apartment 8. Electronic devices malfunctioned with increasing frequency, light bulbs burned out within hours of being replaced, and pets refused to walk past Don Guillermo's door, pulling at their leashes and whimpering. Most disturbing was Don Guillermo himself, on the rare occasions we glimpsed him. In just 3 weeks he had transformed from a merely frail old man to something that barely resembled a human being. His skin hung from his bones like wet paper mottled with dark patches that looked necrotic. His eyes had sunk so deeply into their sockets that they appeared as little more than glittering points in shadowed hollows. And the way he moved jerky, uncoordinated steps, as if his limbs were being manipulated by unseen strings. Yet Lucia continued her daily visits, always with the blue container, always closing the door firmly behind her. Sometimes she would stay for hours. Other times she would emerge after just minutes, often carrying something wrapped in cloth that she would tuck carefully into her bag before leaving. The other residents began to talk, their whispers echoing in the stairwell. "Brujeria?" I overheard Doña Ramirez telling my mother one afternoon. "Witchcraft. My cousin in Oaxaca has seen this before when someone is being consumed from within." "That's superstitious nonsense," my mother replied, but there was no conviction in her voice. "Is it?" Doña Ramirez challenged. "Then explain why the birds won't land on our roof anymore. Explain why Señor Ortiz's dog tried to throw itself from the third-floor window, rather than stay in this building overnight." My mother had no answer for that. On the 10th day after the water incident, I came home from school to find our hallway unusually dark. The single bulb that had illuminated the space for years had not merely burned out, it had shattered, leaving small shards of glass glittering on the floor below. As I carefully stepped around them, I noticed something else, a thin line of dark liquid seeping out from under Don Guillermo's door, tracing a path across the corridor. I knelt to examine it, and the coppery scent of blood filled my nostrils, but mixed with it was another smell, that same putrid sweet odor, now so strong it made my eyes water. As I stared at the viscous fluid, I could have sworn it moved not flowing as liquid should, but pulsing like something alive. A soft sound made me look up. Through the gloom I saw Don Guillermo's door had opened slightly. From within, a hoarse voice, one I barely recognized as the old man's, whispered my name. Diego, help me. Fear rooted me to the spot, even as pity and horror warred within me. Through the narrow opening I could make out Don Guillermo's silhouette, hunched and trembling, one skeletal hand clutching the doorframe. "She's killing me," he rasped. "But death won't end it. She's trapping my soul like she trapped her father's. The ritual, the feeding." "What feeding?" I managed to ask, my voice cracking. "She feeds me, him, and through me he suffers again. A channel. I've become a channel for her vengeance." Before I could respond, Don Guillermo's body jerked violently as if yanked backward by an invisible force. The door began to close, but not before I glimpsed something behind him, a tall, thin shape that seemed to bend at impossible angles, its outline shimmering like heat waves over hot pavement. The door slammed shut with such force that dust rained from the ceiling. I scrambled to my feet and ran to our apartment, fumbling with the key in my shaking hands. Once inside, I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, trying to process what I'd just seen and heard. The ritual, the feeding, trapped souls, none of it made sense, yet a terrible understanding was beginning to form in my mind, one I couldn't fully comprehend, but felt in my bones to be true. Lucia wasn't merely poisoning Don Guillermo, she was using him for something far more sinister, a conduit for suffering that transcended physical death. That evening, when my mother returned from work, I told her everything: Don Guillermo's plea for help, his cryptic words about trapped souls, the strange figure I'd glimpsed behind him. To my surprise, she didn't dismiss my account or try to explain it away. Instead, she sank into a kitchen chair, her face ashen. "I should have known it would come to this," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "The cycle always completes itself." "What cycle, Mama? What do you know about this?" She looked at me for a long moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. Finally, she sighed. "When I was younger, before you were born, I worked briefly for a wealthy family, the Vegas. The father, Don Alfonso, was a powerful man with connections to politicians and businessmen. His wife's brother lived with them, a man named Javier." She paused, her hands fidgeting with her apron. "There was a girl in the household, the daughter of their housekeeper, a quiet child named Lucia." My blood ran cold at the name. "The same Lucia?" My mother nodded. "I didn't realize it until I heard Doña Ramirez mention her full name, Lucia Vega." "She wasn't actually Don Alfonso's daughter, but was raised in his household after her mother died." "What happened to her?" I asked, though some part of me already knew, already dreaded the answer. "Javier, he was not a good man. I sometimes saw bruises on Lucia's arms, the way she flinched when he entered a room. Once I found her crying in the laundry room, her lips split a handprint visible on her cheek." My mother's voice had dropped to a whisper. I should have said something, done something, but I was young, afraid of losing my job, and who would believe a poor maid over the brother-in-law of Don Alfonso Vega? She looked up at me, her eyes swimming with old guilt. I left that job soon after, told myself it wasn't my business. Years later, I heard rumors Javier had died in a hunting accident. Don Alfonso had lost his fortune through bad investments. The family had scattered. "And Lucia," I prompted. "I never knew what became of her, until now." The pieces were beginning to fit together in my mind. Don Guillermo's deterioration, Lucia's special meals, the strange shadow figures that trapped soul. But what does Don Guillermo have to do with any of this? How is he connected to what happened to Lucia? My mother shook her head. "That I don't know, but there must be a connection, some debt she believes he owes." That night the whispers in our apartment grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, dozens of voices speaking in languages both ancient and modern, their messages unintelligible yet filled with urgency. My mother and I sat in the kitchen, neither willing to retreat to our bedrooms, jumping at every creak and groan of the building. Around midnight, a new sound joined the whispers, a low, rhythmic chanting from apartment 8. It rose and fell in a hypnotic cadence, occasionally punctuated by what sounded like Don Guillermo moaning in pain. "We should call the police," I suggested. "And tell them what?" my mother countered. "That we hear chanting, that we suspect a woman is... What exactly do we think she's doing?" I had no answer that wouldn't sound insane to authorities. No one would believe the truth that somehow Lucia was using Don Guillermo as a vessel to trap and torment a soul. That she was feeding him something unnatural as part of an obscene ritual of vengeance. The chanting continued for hours, growing louder and more frenzied as the night deepened. Other residents must have heard it too. I noticed lights turning on in apartments across the courtyard, faces appearing briefly at windows before retreating behind hastily drawn curtains. Everyone heard, yet no one intervened. Like my mother years ago, they chose to look away, to mind their own business in the face of something too terrible to acknowledge. Just before dawn, the chanting stopped abruptly. The sudden silence felt heavier than any noise pressing against my eardrums, like I'd descended deep underwater. Then came a single, piercing scream, not from Don Guillermo this time, but a woman's voice raised in what sounded almost like triumph. My mother and I exchanged glances, both knowing what the other was thinking. Lucia had completed whatever ritual she'd been performing. The next day passed in a haze of exhaustion and dread. I went to school as usual, but couldn't focus on lessons, my mind continually returning to the events of the previous night. During lunch, I noticed my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold my fork. My friend Marcos commented that I looked ill, like you've seen a ghost man, and I nearly laughed at how close to the truth he was. When I returned home that afternoon, the hallway outside Don Guillermo's apartment was spotless, no trace of the dark liquid that had seeped under his door the day before. Even the air seemed clearer, the fetid smell noticeably diminished. Had I imagined it all? Was my exhausted mind playing tricks on me? Then I saw it, a small object placed precisely in the center of our welcome mat. A tiny blue plastic spoon, the kind that might come with the container Lucia always carried. And on it a dark residue that looked disturbingly like dried blood. A message, a warning, a promise. I was still staring at it when the elevator at the end of the hall dinged, a surprising sound given it hadn't worked in years. The doors opened to reveal Lucia, dressed not in her usual black, but in a crisp white dress that made her dark eyes and hair stand out in sharp contrast. She carried no container today, just a small, leather-bound book clutched against her chest. Our eyes met, and she smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her severe features into something almost beautiful, if not for the cold calculation that remained in her gaze. "Diego," she said pleasantly, as if we were old friends. "I was hoping to see you. I have something to ask your mother." "She's not home," I replied quickly. "She's working." "I know her schedule," Lucia said, her smile unwavering. "She'll be home in exactly 27 minutes. The office building on Reforma closes early on Fridays." The fact that she knew such specific details about my mother sent a chill through me. How long had she been watching us, planning whatever came next? "What do you want with her?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. Lucia took a step closer, and I caught a whiff of that same earthy scent I'd noticed before, like freshly dug soil, but with metallic undertones that reminded me of blood. "I want what I've always wanted, Diego. Justice, balance, the completion of a cycle that began long before you were born." "What does that have to do with Don Guillermo, with my mother?" "Witnesses," she replied simply. "Those who saw and remained silent. Those who looked away when they could have intervened." Her smile faded, replaced by an expression of such ancient hatred that I took an involuntary step back. "Your mother was there, Diego. She saw what was happening to me and did nothing." She was just a young girl herself, I protested, afraid of losing her job. And I was just a child, Lucia countered, her voice hardening, afraid of the man who came to my room at night, the man whose friends shared in his entertainments. The implication of her words made my stomach turn. Don Guillermo was one of them. Not directly, but he knew. He was Javier's drinking companion, his confidant. He heard the boasts, the descriptions of what they did to me, and he laughed. Her face contorted with rage and pain. He laughed, Diego. I wanted to disbelieve her, to defend the frail old man I'd known all my life. But something in her eyes, the raw, unhealed wound of decades-old trauma, made denial impossible. "What have you done to him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Lucia's expression softened into something almost pitying. "I've made him a vessel, a channel through which my father's soul can experience what was done to me. With every bite of the meals I prepare, Don Guillermo ingests not just flesh, but suffering. My father's suffering, which becomes his own." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. "You're feeding him your father's remains." She nodded, unnervingly calm. "The body preserves pain, Diego. Every cell remembers the torment it endured. I kept my father's body frozen for 9 years, preparing it according to ancient rituals that bind the consumer to the consumed, that create a bridge between worlds." "You're insane," I whispered. "No," she shook her head slowly. "I'm vengeful. There's a difference." The elevator dinged again, and Lucia glanced at it before returning her gaze to me. "I should check on Don Guillermo. Our work is nearly complete." She stepped past me, then paused. "Tell your mother I'll be visiting her soon. We have much to discuss about the past and her role in what comes next." With those ominous words, she continued down the hall to apartment 8. I noticed that she left no footprints on the dusty floor despite her white shoes that should have shown every speck of dirt. I rushed inside our apartment, locking the door behind me. My mind raced with what I'd learned, the horrific ritual Lucia was performing, her planned retribution against those who had failed her, including my mother. I had to warn her, had to convince her that we needed to leave this building immediately. But when I turned from the door, I froze. Standing in our living room was a figure translucent, wavering like a reflection in disturbed water, but unmistakably the silhouette of a man. His form was distorted, limbs bent at unnatural angles, his head lolling as if his neck could no longer support it. Through his semi-transparent chest, I could see our furniture, the wallpaper behind him. He raised his head with visible effort, revealing a face, partially decomposed features sliding off bone like melting wax. His mouth opened too wide, impossibly wide, and from it came not words, but the same whispers I'd been hearing for weeks, now amplified to an unbearable volume that seemed to vibrate through my skull. I covered my ears, stumbling backward against the door. "Who are you?" I cried. "What do you want?" The whispers abruptly ceased. The figure's mouth closed, then opened again to speak a single sentence in a voice like gravel being crushed. "She's coming for Elena next." With that, the apparition dissolved, collapsing into itself like smoke drawn into an invisible vacuum, leaving me alone in our apartment with the terrible knowledge of what Lucia planned for my mother. I tried calling her workplace, but the line was busy. I considered running to intercept her on her way home, but fear kept me rooted in place. Fear of what might be waiting outside our door, fear of leaving the relative safety of familiar walls. As I stood paralyzed by indecision, I heard a sound from my mother's bedroom, a soft rustling like papers being disturbed by a breeze. Cautiously, I approached her door, which stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, I could see her dresser, atop which she kept a small box of mementos, old photographs, letters, trinkets from her youth. The box was open, its contents spilled across the dresser top. As I watched, the items began to arrange themselves, photos aligning in neat rows, letters unfolding as if read by invisible hands. At the center formed a pattern, my mother's old employee ID from the Vega household, surrounded by photos of a teenage girl I didn't recognize but somehow knew was Lucia. Her solemn eyes staring directly at the camera as if seeing through time itself. From the dresser drawer below, something pushed upward, forcing the drawer open, inch by creaking inch. A small blue plastic container identical to the one Lucia carried rose into view, hovering momentarily before settling beside the arranged items. My legs nearly gave way beneath me. I grabbed the door frame for support, watching in horror as the container's lid slowly lifted on its own. Inside was a dark, viscous substance that glistened in the dim light, moving with a life of its own, forming shapes that resembled faces screaming in silent agony. A voice neither male nor female, neither young nor old, spoke from the empty air beside me. "The vessel is prepared. The cycle continues." What was witnessed in silence must be answered in screams. The lid slammed shut with such force that the container cracked, dark fluid seeping through like blood from a wound. On my mother's mirror, words appeared as if etched by an invisible finger, the glass frosting around each letter she knew. She saw. She turned away. In that moment I understood with terrible clarity Don Guillermo had been merely the first. Lucia's vengeance would not end with him. My mother, and perhaps others who had witnessed her abuse and remained silent, were next in line for her ritualistic punishment. And I, caught between worlds I barely comprehended, was the only one who knew what was coming. I stood frozen in my mother's doorway, staring at the ominous message on her mirror, when I heard the apartment door open. My heart leapt to my throat. Lucia had said my mother wouldn't be home for another 20 minutes. Had she come to find me? "Diego, are you home?" Relief flooded through me at the sound of my mother's familiar voice. I rushed from the bedroom to find her in the entranceway, looking exhausted but mercifully alive. "Mama!" I threw my arms around her, holding her so tightly she let out a small sound of surprise. "What's wrong?" she asked, pulling back to examine my face. "You look terrified." I opened my mouth to tell her everything about my encounter with Lucia, the ghostly apparition in our living room, the floating container and message in her bedroom, when a blood-curdling scream tore through the building. It came from apartment 8, a sound of such pure agony and terror that it seemed to vibrate the very walls around us. My mother dropped her purse, her face draining of color. "Dios mío, what was that?" "Don Guillermo," I whispered. Though the scream had been barely recognizable as human, something in me knew with certainty who had made it. The scream came again, followed by a series of thuds so powerful they shook dust from our ceiling, like someone was being thrown repeatedly against the walls. Then came the sound of glass shattering, and a woman's voice, Lucia's, raised in what might have been prayer or incantation, the words indistinct, but the rhythm unmistakable. "We should call the police," I said, reaching for our phone. My mother caught my wrist. "No, they won't understand what they're walking into." Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was determination in her voice. "This is between Lucia and those who failed her, including me." Before I could protest, there was a rapid knocking at our door, not the measured, deliberate taps of Lucia's usual knock, but frantic, desperate pounding. "Elena, Diego, please help me." We exchanged startled glances. It was Lucia's voice, but stripped of its usual calm control, now high-pitched with panic. My mother hesitated, then moved toward the door. "Don't open it," I hissed. "It's a trick." "We can't be sure of that," she replied, though her hand trembled as she reached for the lock. "What if she's in real danger?" The pounding continued, more insistent. "Please, something's happening to him. I can't control it anymore." My mother made her decision. She unlatched the chain and opened the door. Lucia stood in the hallway, her pristine white dress now splattered with dark stains. Her hair had come loose from its severe bun, hanging in wild tangles around her face. Most shocking were her eyes, wide with genuine fear, the calculating coldness replaced by raw terror. "You have to help," she gasped. "It's Don Guillermo. The ritual. Something's gone wrong." "What ritual?" my mother demanded. "What have you done to him?" Lucia's eyes darted nervously toward apartment 8. "There's no time to explain. But he's dying, and if he dies before the ritual completes, the souls will be trapped between worlds. Endless suffering." "Please, you have to help me finish it properly." Despite every instinct screaming against it, I found myself curious. What could have frightened someone as controlled as Lucia so thoroughly? What had gone wrong with her macabre plans? "Why should we help you?" my mother asked, her voice hard. "After what you've done, after what you planned to do to me." Lucia's expression shifted, surprise briefly overriding her panic. "You know, Diego told me everything. Your revenge, your special meals, your plans for those who witnessed and did nothing." For a moment, Lucia's fear seemed to recede, the cold calculation returning to her eyes. Then another scream came from apartment 8, not Don Guillermo's this time, but something deeper, more guttural, as if it originated from somewhere beyond human vocal cords. "He's coming through," Lucia whispered, genuine terror returning. "My father's soul is manifesting physically, but it's not just him anymore. The barrier is thinning." Others are following. As if to confirm her words, the hallway light exploded in a shower of sparks. In the momentary darkness, I saw shapes moving along the walls, distorted, crawling figures that left glistening trails behind them like snails, but moved with the jerking speed of insects. When the emergency lights flickered on, seconds later, the walls were clean, but the air had turned frigid, our breath visible in small, frightened clouds. "You know about these things," Lucia said to my mother. "I can see it in your eyes. You've witnessed the hidden world before." My mother's posture changed subtly, a recognition passing between the two women that I didn't understand. "My grandmother was a curandera," my mother admitted quietly. "I learned some things from her, things I've tried to forget." "Then you know I'm telling the truth. If the souls break through completely, they won't be bound by the ritual's constraints. They'll be free to seek their own vengeance." Another crash from apartment 8, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. "He needs help," Lucia insisted. "Whatever you think of me, Don Guillermo is suffering in ways no one should endure." My mother's compassion, the same quality that had made her look away years ago, rather than confront ugliness directly now, propelled her forward. "I'll see what I can do, but Diego stays here." "No," I grabbed her arm. "I'm coming with you." "It's not safe." "Neither is staying alone," I countered, "especially not with whatever's happening." She hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Stay behind me. Don't touch anything." We followed Lucia into the hallway, which seemed to stretch and distort as we approached apartment 8, as if the physical space itself was being warped by what occurred inside. The door hung partially open, revealing darkness beyond. From within came sounds no human should make, wet gurgling noises, punctuated by whimpers and the brittle cracking of bones. "What will we see in there?" my mother asked Lucia, her voice barely audible. "The truth," Lucia replied simply. "The consequence of willful blindness." She pushed the door open wider, and the stench hit us like a physical blow, that same sweet, putrid decay, but now amplified tenfold, mixed with the metallic tang of fresh blood and something older, mustier, like ancient tomb air released after centuries of containment. My mother gasped, covering her mouth and nose with her sleeve. I fought the urge to vomit, my eyes watering as we stepped across the threshold into Don Guillermo's apartment. The living room was in chaos. Furniture overturned, walls smeared with dark substances that dripped and pooled on the worn carpet. Candles had been placed in a circular pattern around the room, their flames burning an unnatural blue-green that cast sickly light across the scene. Most disturbing were the symbols painted on every surface, intricate spiraling patterns that seemed to move when viewed peripherally. Characters from no alphabet I recognized that nonetheless filled me with visceral dread, as if some primal part of me understood their terrible meaning. "Where is he?" my mother asked, her voice muffled behind her sleeve. As if an answer, a moan came from the kitchen. We moved cautiously toward it, stepping over broken glass and what looked disturbingly like gnawed bones scattered across the floor. The kitchen was worse. Every surface was covered with the remnants of Lucia's cooking, dried blood, strange herbs, tied in bundles, jars containing things that had never been sold in any market I knew. At the center, slumped in a chair that had been placed inside a circle drawn in what looked like ashes mixed with blood, sat Don Guillermo, or what remained of him. The man I had known all my life was barely recognizable. His skin hung in loose folds from a frame that seemed to have shrunk, the bones visible beneath like a poorly covered skeleton. His eyes were sunken so deeply that the sockets appeared hollow except for the feverish gleam that shone from their depths. Most horrifying was his mouth stretched impossibly wide, the jaw dislocated to accommodate whatever had been forced into it, dark fluid leaking from the corners to stain the front of his tattered shirt. But he was not alone in that broken body. Standing behind him, visible as a shimmering outline that wavered like heat haze, was a figure that could only be described as Don Guillermo's shadow self, a negative image that moved independently, sometimes aligning with his body, sometimes stretching away as if trying to separate entirely. And within this shadow danced other smaller shapes like parasites writhing beneath skin. "Dios mío," my mother whispered, "what have you done to him?" Lucia moved to a small altar set up on the kitchen counter where black candles surrounded a leather-bound book. "I made him a vessel, a channel through which my father's soul could return. But something went wrong." She gestured toward Don Guillermo. "Look closely. Do you see it?" At first I saw only the horror of Don Guillermo's condition. But as my eyes adjusted to the strange light, I noticed something else, a second face occasionally superimposing itself over his like a mask, partially melded with the skin beneath. An older face, craggier, with a thick mustache and cold, hateful eyes. The face would appear for seconds at a time, then sink back into Don Guillermo's features like a drowning man pulled under turbulent waters. "Your father," my mother said, recognition in her voice. "Yes," Lucia nodded. "But there are others now, too. The ritual was meant only for him to bind his soul to Don Guillermo's to make them experience as one what they had done to me." Her voice broke slightly. "But the barrier has been weakened. Other souls are trying to use the channel I created." As if to confirm her words, Don Guillermo's face briefly transformed again, this time into a younger man's features contorted with rage, then a woman's, her mouth stretched in a silent scream, then a child's eyes wide with confusion and terror. "How do we stop it?" my mother asked. "The ritual must be completed properly," Lucia replied, turning pages in her book with trembling fingers. "The final meal must be consumed and the binding words spoken. Then the souls can be released. And if we don't complete it—" Lucia looked up, her eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. "Then the barrier continues to weaken. More souls cross over. The apartment, the building, perhaps beyond all, become a crossroads between worlds. The living possessed by the dead, forced to experience death in endless variations while still trapped in breathing bodies." My mother turned to Don Guillermo, compassion warring with disgust on her face. "Has he been aware through all of this?" "Intermittently," Lucia admitted. "At first he knew exactly what was happening, why it was happening. I wanted him to understand. Later, as my father's soul grew stronger within him, Don Guillermo's consciousness was pushed aside. But he resurfaces sometimes." She paused. "He begs for death when he does." "This has to stop," my mother said firmly. "Not just for him, but for you too, Lucia. This vengeance has consumed you as surely as it's consuming him." "It's too late for that," Lucia replied. "The ritual must be completed, one way or another." She moved to the refrigerator, an ancient model that hummed and rattled ominously in the corner. "The final preparation is in here, the heart preserved for last." My stomach lurched at her words. I had suspected, had even heard her admission that she was feeding Don Guillermo her father's remains, but the clinical way she discussed it made the horror freshly immediate. Lucia pulled open the refrigerator door, and I couldn't suppress a gasp at what was revealed inside. The shelves had been removed to make space for dozens of blue containers, each labeled meticulously with dates and cryptic symbols. But dominating the center was a large glass jar containing what was unmistakably a human heart suspended in a dark liquid that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, tiny bubbles forming and rising as if the organ was still somehow respiring, despite being separated from its body. Surrounding the jar were objects I initially took for bizarre cooking ingredients: bundles of dried herbs tied with human hair, small bones arranged in patterns, vials of powders in various shades of red and black, and several small cloth dolls, each pinned with what looked like needles made from bone splinters. "Black magic," my mother whispered. "Not just feeding him remains, but binding spells, soul traps." Lucia nodded. "The recipes were in my grandmother's grimoire. She came from a long line of practitioners in Veracruz. Knowledge preserved from before the conquistadors, mixed with what came after." "This is evil," my mother said, but without judgment in her voice, simply stating a fact. "So was what they did to me," Lucia replied evenly. She reached for the jar containing the heart, cradling it almost tenderly. "The final meal. Once consumed, the binding is complete. Then the release ritual can begin." As she turned toward Don Guillermo with the jar, his body suddenly convulsed violently. His back arched at an impossible angle, and a voice emerged from his distended mouth, not his own, but a chorus of overlapping voices, some screaming, some pleading, some laughing with manic glee. "Too late," the voices proclaimed in disturbing unison. "The door stands open, we come through." Don Guillermo's shadow self suddenly expanded, stretching across the ceiling and walls like spilled ink, forming new shapes that peeled away from the central mass, vague humanoid outlines that solidified as they separated, dozens of them crawling across every surface. "No," Lucia cried, nearly dropping the jar. "The containment circle is breaking." I looked down and saw that the ash and blood circle surrounding Don Guillermo's chair had indeed been disrupted, whether by his convulsions or some other force, I couldn't tell. But the consequences were immediately apparent as the temperature in the room plummeted, frost forming instantly on the windows and metal surfaces. One of the shadow figures lunged toward my mother, moving with the jerky staccato motion of old film footage. I shouted a warning, but before it reached her, Lucia stepped between them, clutching the jar protectively. "You cannot have her," Lucia shouted at the shadow. "She is mine to judge, mine to punish." The shadow paused, hovering before Lucia like smoke caught in conflicting currents. Then, with a movement almost too swift to follow, it plunged into her chest. Lucia gasped, her body going rigid. The jar slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor and releasing its contents, the heart flopping obscenely amid broken glass and dark fluid that crawled across the tile like it had a mind of its own, forming the same strange symbols I'd seen throughout the apartment. My mother grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the doorway. "We need to leave now." But Lucia's hand shot out, gripping my mother's wrist with supernatural strength. When she raised her head, her face had changed now, superimposed with the features of a man I'd never seen, but somehow recognized Javier, the abuser from her childhood. "Elena," Lucia's mouth said in a man's voice, smooth, cultured, with an undertone of cruelty. "How lovely to see you again. Still turning a blind eye. Still walking away when things become uncomfortable." My mother tried to pull free, but Lucia's grip tightened until I could see bruises forming beneath her fingers. "Let her go," I shouted, grabbing a fallen candlestick and swinging it at Lucia's arm. She released my mother, turning to me with a twisted smile that belonged to the man now sharing her body. "The little hero," Javier's voice mocked. "Do you know what your mother did, or rather, what she didn't do?" "I know enough," I replied, positioning myself between them and my mother. "And I know you're not Lucia. You're using her like you used her before." The thing wearing Lucia's face laughed a horrible sound that contained too many voices layered over one another. She invited us in with her ritual, opened the way between worlds. Did she think vengeance would flow in only one direction? Behind Lucia, Don Guillermo had gone still, his head lolling at an unnatural angle, eyes open, but unseeing. The shadow figures continued to peel away from his form, more numerous now, filling the apartment with writhing darkness. Some had begun to take more defined shapes, men and women from different eras, their forms marked by the wounds that had likely ended their lives, hanging ropes, bullet holes, gaping knife wounds. "The building sits on old ground," Lucia Javier continued conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather rather than surrounded by manifesting spirits. A burial site from before recorded history, then a convent with its own dark secrets, then a hospital during the Revolution. The smile widened unnaturally. So many deaths, so much unfinished business. Lucia's little ritual was just the key to a very old lock. My mother had begun whispering under her breath words I didn't recognize but which sounded ancient, rhythmic, almost like the prayers my great-grandmother used to say, but older somehow with sounds that Spanish or even Nahuatl didn't contain. Lucia's body stiffened, the smile faltering. "What are you doing?" Javier's voice demanded, now tinged with uncertainty. "What I should have done years ago," my mother replied, her voice gaining strength as she continued her incantation. "Standing against you, against all of this." She reached into her pocket and withdrew something I'd never seen before, a small bundle of dried herbs tied with red thread, with what looked like a tiny bird's skull woven into its center. She clutched it tightly in her fist as her words grew louder. "My grandmother taught me more than I admitted," she told Lucia Javier. "I turned away from that knowledge just as I turned away from what was happening to Lucia, but I never forgot." The shadow figures seemed agitated by my mother's words, their movements becoming more frenzied, some retreating from her while others pressed closer, reaching with limbs that elongated impossibly. Lucia's body began to tremble, her head twitching as if multiple entities fought for control within her. When she spoke again, it was with her own voice, though strained and broken. "Help me," she pleaded, momentarily breaking through Javier's possession. "I didn't know it would be like this. I only wanted justice." "Justice or vengeance?" my mother asked, still clutching the strange talisman. "Did you think making Don Guillermo suffer would heal what was done to you?" "I thought," Lucia gasped, fighting to maintain control of her own body, "I thought if they experienced my pain, I would finally be free of it." Her face contorted Javier's features briefly, reasserting themselves before she fought them back. But it only gave it new forms, new vessels. She staggered toward us, her movements jerky and uncoordinated as the competing entities within her vied for dominance. "You have to complete the ritual properly, the closing, not the binding. In the book." She gestured weakly toward the leather volume still open on the altar. My mother glanced at the grimoire, then back at Lucia. "I can't read those symbols." "I'll guide you," Lucia said, then cried out as her body seized again, back arching unnaturally. When she straightened, Javier's voice had returned thick with malice. "She's lying to you, Elena. There is no closing ritual. Only more openings, more vessels to fill." The mouth stretched in a terrible smile. "Starting with you. And then your precious son." Don Guillermo's body suddenly jerked upright in the chair, moving like a puppet controlled by clumsy hands. His mouth opened wider than any human mouth should, and from it poured not words but a stream of shadowy matter like black smoke, but with substance and weight pooling on the floor before rising to form new shapes. My mother shoved me toward the door. "Run, Diego." But I couldn't leave her. Instead, I grabbed the grimoire from the altar, instinctively knowing it was important. The book was heavier than it looked and warm to the touch, as if recently alive. As my fingers closed around it, the shadow figures surged toward me, drawn to the tome like moths to flame. "The heart!" Lucia screamed in her own voice, momentarily resurfacing. "Put it back in the circle. Complete the circuit." I looked down at the heart that had spilled from the broken jar, now pulsing visibly on the kitchen floor, as if still somehow alive. Moving on instinct, I snatched it up, cringing at the slick, meaty feel of it in my hand, and threw it back inside the broken circle where Don Guillermo sat. The effect was immediate. The heart burst into blue flames upon landing in the circle, and Don Guillermo's body jerked as if electrocuted. The shadow figures froze momentarily, then began to contract, drawn back toward the burning heart like water down a drain. "The words," Lucia gasped, pointing to the grimoire in my hands. Page 63. The release, not the binding. I fumbled with the ancient pages, trying to find the right one, while keeping an eye on the shadows that were being pulled back toward Don Guillermo, but fighting against the current, reaching desperately towards us with elongating limbs. "Here!" I thrust the open book toward my mother. "Can you read it?" She took the grimoire, her eyes widening as she scanned the text. "It's in Nahuatl, but an old form." She began to read aloud, her pronunciation hesitant at first, then growing more confident as some ancestral memory seemed to guide her tongue. Lucia crawled toward us, her body still battleground between her own consciousness and Javier's invading spirit. "The circle," she gasped. "It must be completed again." My mother continued reading, her voice strengthening with each word. The shadows whirled faster around Don Guillermo, who sat motionless, except for his mouth, which moved in sync with my mother's words, though no sound emerged from it. I looked around frantically for something to repair the broken circle. My eyes fell on a knife on the kitchen counter, an ordinary kitchen knife, but with strange symbols etched into the blade, the handle wrapped in what looked like human hair. "Will this work?" I asked Lucia, showing her the knife. She nodded weakly. "Your blood, just a few drops, to complete the circuit." I hesitated, but my mother's voice faltered as she read, and I saw the shadows beginning to resist their inward pull again. "Do it," my mother commanded between phrases of the ritual text. Quickly, with a deep breath, I drew the knife across my palm, just enough to break the skin. Blood welled up immediately, and I knelt to let it drip along the broken section of the circle, connecting the interrupted lines. As my blood touched the ash mixture, it sizzled and smoked the droplets, expanding and running together until the circle was whole again. The shadows' resistance redoubled their forms, stretching and distorting as they fought against the strengthening pull. Lucia managed to crawl to the edge of the circle, her body trembling violently as Javier's spirit fought for dominance. "I'm sorry," she whispered, looking directly at my mother, "for all of this, for dragging you into my darkness." My mother paused in her reading, meeting Lucia's gaze. "I was already part of it," she replied softly, "from the moment I chose to look away." She resumed the incantation, the ancient words flowing more naturally now. As she neared what appeared to be the end of the text, Don Guillermo's body began to shake, small tremors at first, then violent convulsions that threatened to topple his chair and break the circle again. "Hold him!" Lucia cried, lunging forward to grasp his shoulders. I hesitated, repulsed by the thought of touching that ravaged form, but my mother's steady voice compelled me to action. I moved behind the chair, helping Lucia hold Don Guillermo in place as my mother spoke the final words of the ritual. The heart in the center of the circle burst into higher flames, blue-green fire reaching toward the ceiling. Don Guillermo's eyes snapped open, clear and aware for perhaps the first time in weeks, meeting mine with a look of profound gratitude and relief. His mouth moved, forming words I could barely hear over the roaring of the flames and the howling of the trapped shadows. "Thank you," he whispered. "End it, please." My mother spoke the final phrase of the ritual, her voice ringing with authority that seemed to come from somewhere beyond herself. The blue-green flames surged upward, engulfing Don Guillermo's body completely, yet I felt no heat from them, only an intense cold that penetrated to my bones. Lucia cried out not in pain but in release as Javier's spirit was torn from her body, visible for a moment as a dark silhouette being pulled into the flame. Her hand, still gripping Don Guillermo's shoulders, began to smoke and blacken, but she held on, her face set in grim determination. "Lucia, let go!" I shouted, trying to pull her away. She shook her head. "I started this. I must end it." The flames rose higher, and within them I could see shapes forming and dissolving, faces emerging from the fire, only to be consumed again, some screaming in rage, others in relief. At the center of it all, Don Guillermo's body began to crumble like ancient parchment turning to ash that was drawn upward into the spectral conflagration. Lucia looked at my mother one last time. "Was it worth it?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the roar of the otherworldly fire. "My vengeance, this ending," my mother's eyes filled with tears. "No vengeance is worth this price, Lucia, for either of us." Lucia nodded, a sad smile crossing her face. "Perhaps you're right. Too late for me to learn that lesson." She turned back to the flames, her arms now engulfed up to the elbows. "But not too late for you two. Go now, before the barrier seals with you on this side." "Come with us," I urged, still trying to pull her away. "I can't," she replied calmly. "Someone must guide them through, someone who knows both worlds." Her eyes met mine with surprising clarity. "Besides, where else would I go? What life remains for me after this?" The kitchen began to warp around us, walls bending inward, as if under enormous pressure, the boundary between physical reality and whatever lay beyond growing thin as paper. Through the windows I could see our building's courtyard distorting similarly, neighbors standing frozen in tableau of horror as they witnessed the impossible transformations. "Run!" Lucia commanded, her voice gaining strength even as her physical form began to lose definition, merging with the flames that now consumed Don Guillermo entirely. "The pathway closes." My mother grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door. I resisted for a moment, unwilling to leave Lucia to her fate. "She's made her choice," my mother said, her voice gentle but firm. "We must make ours." With a final look at Lucia, now barely distinguishable from the swirling vortex of fire and shadow that had replaced Don Guillermo, we fled from the apartment. The hallway outside had transformed as well, elongating impossibly, the walls breathing like living tissue doors along its length, opening and closing of their own accord to reveal glimpses of other times, other tragedies that had occurred within the building's history. We ran, pursued by tendrils of shadow that snaked along the floor and walls, reaching for our ankles, our shoulders, anything they could grasp to pull us back. Behind us, apartment 8 had become a nexus of light and darkness. Cold fire spilling from its doorway and windows, the screams of countless souls, both in torment and in release, forming a cacophony that threatened to shatter sanity. Just as we reached the stairwell, a final explosion of energy burst from the apartment. The shock wave knocked us off our feet, sending us tumbling down the stairs in a tangle of limbs and panic. I felt something snap in my wrist as I tried to break my fall, pain lancing up my arm as we landed in a heap at the bottom of the first flight. "Can you move?" my mother gasped, already struggling to her feet. I nodded, cradling my injured wrist, but otherwise intact. We helped each other up and continued our descent, no longer running but moving as quickly as our battered bodies would allow. Around us, the building groaned and shifted like a living entity in pain cracks spreading across walls and ceilings. Dust and plaster raining down in fine clouds. Other residents were fleeing as well, emerging from their apartments in various states of dress and panic. No one spoke. No explanations were needed in the face of the building's impossible transformation. We all simply ran, driven by the primal instinct to escape. As we burst through the lobby doors into the courtyard, I looked back at our building. The entire structure seemed to be contracting, the upper floors compressing downward as if under immense weight, windows shattering in sequence from top to bottom. A strange light pulsed from every opening, blue-green one moment, pitch black the next. And in those alternating flashes I caught glimpses of figures in the windows, hundreds of them pressing against the glass like prisoners seeking escape. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The building froze in its distorted state, the light from its windows extinguished, leaving only ordinary darkness. The screams cut off mid-wail, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to absorb all other sound traffic from nearby streets, the panicked voices of our neighbors, even the sound of our own breathing. For one suspended moment the world held its breath. Then with a sound like a massive indrawn breath, the building snapped back to its original form, windows reforming, walls straightening as if the past hour had been nothing but a shared hallucination. The only evidence that anything had occurred was the stream of shaken residents in the courtyard clutching whatever possessions they'd managed to grab in their flight. "Is it over?" I whispered to my mother, still cradling my injured wrist. She stared up at the now ordinary facade, her expression unreadable. "For now," she replied softly. "But some doors once opened can never be fully closed." As if to confirm her words, I saw a figure in the window of apartment 8, just for a moment silhouetted against a faint blue glow. Not Don Guillermo, whose remains had crumbled to ash in the ritual fire. Not Lucia, who had chosen to guide the trapped souls to whatever lay beyond. It was a shadow that belonged to neither of them, yet contained elements of both, a merging of souls caught between worlds. It raised a hand in what might have been farewell or warning, then faded from view as the last of the blue light winked out. My mother put her arm around my shoulders, turning me away from the building that had been our home for as long as I could remember. "Come," she said gently. "We can't stay here anymore." "Where will we go?" I asked, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of our situation, homeless, with only the clothes on our backs and whatever was in my mother's purse. "To my sister's in Coyoacan for tonight." She guided me toward the street where some of our neighbors were already hailing taxis or calling relatives. After that, somewhere far from here, somewhere new. As we walked away, I felt a strange weight in my pocket that hadn't been there before. Reaching in with my uninjured hand, I discovered the small leather-bound notebook from Lucia's altar, the grimoire containing the ancient rituals. I must have unconsciously pocketed it in the chaos of our escape. I started to show it to my mother, then hesitated. The book seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat against my fingers, neither warm nor cold, but somehow both simultaneously. Knowledge that should perhaps remain buried yet had saved us when we needed it most. I slipped it back into my pocket without a word. Some decisions could wait for daylight, for safety, for distance from the night's horrors. For now it was enough that we had survived, that we were together, that we were walking away from apartment 8 and whatever lingered there in the spaces between worlds. But as we reached the street, I couldn't resist one final glance back at our building. In the window of apartment 8, now dark and still, I thought I saw a flicker of movement. A hand pressing against the glass, 5 fingers splayed wide before dissolving into shadow once more. And though the night air was warm around us, I shivered, knowing with bone-deep certainty that what had begun in that apartment was far from finished. The ritual had been completed, yes, but not ended, never ended. Some cycles once set in motion continue eternally. Some hungers once awakened can never truly be satisfied. Some souls, once bound together through vengeance and suffering, remain connected across the boundaries of life and death, world and underworld, past and future. As if reading my thoughts, my mother squeezed my shoulder. "Don't look back, Diego," she whispered. "Whatever is behind us, let it stay there." I nodded and turned away from the building for the last time, focusing instead on the street ahead, the distant lights of the city, the promise of temporary sanctuary at my aunt's home. But even as we walked away, I felt something following, not physically, but like a thin thread connecting us to what we'd witnessed and participated in. A thread that could never be fully severed, only stretched thinner across time and distance. The grimoire pulsed once more against my leg, as if in acknowledgement of this truth. And somewhere deep in my mind I heard Lucia's voice one final time. "Every meal has its price, little one, even a soul's meal." 10 years passed like a fever dream. My mother and I never returned to that building, not even to retrieve our possessions. Whatever remnants of our former life remained in apartment 7, we surrendered them to the shadows that had taken residence there. Some sacrifices are worth making when the alternative is to risk your soul. We stayed with my aunt in Coyoacan for 3 months, sleeping on a fold-out couch in her tiny living room. I attended a new school where no one knew about the night of blue fire and wandering spirits, where I could pretend to be normal despite the nightmares that continued to plague me. My mother found work cleaning offices again, this time in a modern building, with bright lights and security guards, a place where shadows had nowhere to hide. Eventually, we saved enough to rent a small apartment on the other side of the city. My broken wrist healed, though it still aches when rain is coming. The physical scars faded faster than the mental ones. The grimoire remained hidden in a shoebox beneath my bed. I never showed it to my mother, though. Sometimes I caught her looking at me with a knowing expression, as if she sensed its presence. I never opened it, never read the words that had both saved and damned us that night, but I couldn't bring myself to destroy it either. Some knowledge, once acquired, refuses to be abandoned even when we wish to be free of it. As I grew older, the memories of apartment 8 began to feel more distant, like something I'd watched in a horror movie rather than lived through. I graduated high school, then university, with a degree in psychology, my attempt to understand the darkness I'd witnessed, perhaps, or to help others facing their own versions of it. I specialized in trauma therapy, working with survivors of abuse. If I couldn't erase Lucia's suffering or my mother's guilt, at least I could try to prevent others from walking the same path of vengeance and regret. My mother never spoke of that night, nor of her past connection to the Vega household where Lucia had suffered. But sometimes when she thought I wasn't looking, I'd catch her making small protective gestures, touching the saint medallion she always wore, or whispering words in an ancient language I couldn't quite catch. The knowledge her grandmother had passed down, once awakened, remained an active force in her life. We built a new existence brick by careful brick. We were survivors, after all. What choice did we have but to continue? Then, on the 10th anniversary of that night, everything changed again. I was living alone by then in a modern apartment near my practice. My mother had moved to Guadalajara 2 years earlier, seeking distance not just from Mexico City, but from the memories that lingered there. We spoke weekly, our conversations carefully avoiding any mention of apartment 8 or its occupants. I returned home late after a difficult session with a client. The moment I opened my door, I knew something was wrong. The air inside felt charged like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. And there was a smell, faint but unmistakable, that sweet, putrid odor I'd tried so hard to forget. On my kitchen table sat a small blue plastic container. I froze in the doorway, keys still in hand, escape still possible. But curiosity, that same fatal curiosity that had drawn me to Don Guillermo's apartment a decade ago, pulled me forward. The container was identical to the ones Lucia had carried, ordinary, unremarkable, the kind sold in any supermarket. There was no note, no indication of who had placed it there, or how they had entered my locked apartment. With trembling hands, I approached the table. The container seemed to pulse slightly, as if something inside was alive and breathing. I knew I shouldn't open it, knew with absolute certainty that whatever was inside would irreversibly change my life again. Yet my fingers moved of their own accord, lifting the lid to reveal what lay within. It wasn't food or flesh or anything physical at all. Instead, the container held what appeared to be a small vortex of shadow, a miniature version of what I'd seen consuming Don Guillermo that night. It spun slowly, wisps of darkness reaching up like curious fingers before retreating back into the central mass. As I stared mesmerized, it began to take shape, forming a face I recognized despite the passing years. Lucia, her features reconstructed in living shadow, her eyes 2 points of blue-green light that fixed on mine with terrible recognition. Diego. The shadows whispered, her voice unchanged by death or the decade between us. "You've grown." I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. "You're dead," I managed to say, though I knew such distinctions meant little after what I'd witnessed. "Death is merely a transition," the shadow Lucia replied. "A doorway, not an ending. Surely you've guessed that by now." "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my back pressed against the wall. "We completed your ritual. We closed the pathway." The shadow shifted, forming a smile that contained no warmth. "You narrowed it. You didn't close it." "Some doors can never be fully shut once opened." She rose from the container, her form expanding until it hovered before me at life size, not solid, but not entirely incorporeal either. Through her I could see my kitchen distorted as if viewed through dark water. "The cycle continues, Diego. It must. Justice demands it." "Your vengeance destroyed you," I countered. "It consumed Don Guillermo, nearly consumed my mother and me. When does it end, Lucia?" "When the debt is paid in full." She drifted closer and I felt the temperature drop around me. "Your mother was only one witness who remained silent. There were others who saw and did nothing. Others who must face what their inaction allowed." Understanding dawned, cold and terrible. "That's why you're here. You want me to continue your work." "Who better?" The shadow Lucia circled me slowly. "You who have carried my grimoire for 10 years, feeling its power grow within you. You who understand both sides of suffering, the victim and the witness." I thought of the shoebox under my bed, of the leather-bound book I'd never opened yet couldn't discard. Had it been influencing me all this time? Had my career choice, my specialization in trauma therapy, been my own decision at all? "I won't become what you became," I insisted. "I help people heal from trauma not inflicted as punishment." "Do you?" She paused before me, her shadowy head tilting slightly. "Then why do so many of your clients report dreams of blue fire? Why do they find themselves drawn to ritual and revenge after speaking with you?" "The darkness recognizes darkness, Diego, even when you try to hide it behind degrees and therapeutic language." Her words struck a nerve. I had indeed noticed strange patterns in my clients' progress, dreams, and impulses they reported that had seemed oddly familiar. I had attributed it to the universal nature of trauma response, but what if it was something else? What if unknowingly I had been spreading Lucia's influence, her vengeance, through my work? "I never opened the grimoire," I whispered. "You didn't need to." The shadow Lucia laughed softly. "Some knowledge seeps through by proximity alone. Your blood completed the circle that night. You became part of the ritual part of me." She extended a shadowy hand, not quite touching me, but close enough that I felt a deep, penetrating cold against my skin. "Tonight marks 10 years. The cycle renews. You will be my vessel now, as Don Guillermo was for my father's soul." "I refuse," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "You have no choice. The meal has already begun." With those words, she lunged forward, her shadow form engulfing me in cold darkness. I felt her enter through every pore, every breath, a liquid darkness filling me from within. I tried to scream but had no voice, tried to move but found my limbs responding to a will not my own. When the darkness receded, I stood alone in my kitchen once more. The blue container had vanished. Nothing visible had changed, yet everything was different. I could feel Lucia within me, not controlling me completely, but present a passenger watching through my eyes. "You see," her voice whispered in my mind, "this is a gentler merger than what I did to Don Guillermo, a partnership, not a possession. Together we will find those who still owe a debt for their silence." I staggered to the bathroom, needing to see my reflection to confirm I was still myself. In the mirror, my face appeared normal, except for my eyes. They now held flecks of blue-green light, visible only when the angle was just right. "First on our list," Lucia's voice continued, "is Javier's son. He knew what his father did to me. He heard my cries through the wall. He sits on the board of a children's charity now, playing the philanthropist while carrying his father's corruption in his blood." Images flashed in my mind: a man in an expensive suit, an opulent office, a blue plastic container being placed on his desk. The sweet anticipation of vengeance, the hunger for justice so intense it felt like physical starvation. I gripped the sink, fighting against her influence. "No, I won't become your instrument of torture." "You already are," she replied calmly. "You have been for 10 years in small ways. Now we merely make it official. The grimoire has prepared you. Your blood sealed your participation. The cycle continues with or without your conscious cooperation." I felt my hand reach for my phone without my willing it, fingers dialing a number I didn't recognize. When a man's voice answered, my mouth formed words that weren't mine. "Senor Vega, my name is Dr. Diego Morales. I'm a trauma therapist specializing in cases like yours. I understand you've been having troubling dreams lately, dreams of blue fire and shadows that speak your name." The sharp intake of breath on the other end told me Lucia had already been at work sending her nightmares to prepare him as she had prepared Don Guillermo, as she had prepared me. "I can help you," my voice continued, though inside I screamed in silent protest. "I have a special therapy technique passed down through generations. When could we meet tomorrow? Excellent. And please come hungry. I'll provide a very special meal." As I hung up, I caught my reflection again in the bathroom mirror. My smile wasn't my own. It contained too many teeth stretched too wide across my face. My eyes glowed fully now with that blue-green light, no longer just flecks, but pools of otherworldly illumination. "The soul's meal must be served," Lucia whispered within me. "The cycle must continue. The debt must be paid." I felt my resistance weakening, her hunger becoming my own. Her vengeance merging with some dark part of myself that I'd never fully acknowledged, the part that had kept the grimoire all these years, that had been drawn to work with trauma victims, that had always wondered what justice truly looked like for those whose wounds never healed. That night I dreamed of blue fire and ancient rituals. I dreamed of a table set with blue plastic containers, each holding a piece of someone's soul. I dreamed of feeding them to those who had turned away, who had closed their eyes, who had chosen comfort over courage. And when I woke, I found myself in my kitchen preparing a special meal with ingredients I didn't remember purchasing following recipes. I didn't remember learning while humming a tune. I didn't recognize a melodic, hypnotic song in a language older than Spanish, older than conquest. The cycle continues. The meal must be served. And I, who once escaped the shadows of apartment 8, have become their most devoted servant. Remember this warning should you ever encounter a blue plastic container or catch a whiff of sweet putrid decay or notice flecks of blue-green light in a stranger's eyes. Some vengeance never ends. Some hunger is never satisfied, and some meals once begun must be consumed to the very last bite.